The fastest way to discover who truly loves you is to watch who stays when your perfect day falls apart. Emma Hayes stood alone beneath an arch covered in white roses as soft piano music continued playing for a wedding that no longer existed. Nearly 200 guests filled the elegant lakeside ceremony overlooking the peaceful waters outside Charleston, South Carolina, whispering quietly as minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. Bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances while family members repeatedly checked their phones. The empty space beside Emma, where her fiancé Ryan Mitchell should have been standing, somehow grew larger with every passing second. Finally, the wedding coordinator approached with trembling hands, holding a cell phone she clearly wished she did not have to deliver. Emma accepted it without saying a word. A single message appeared across the screen. "I cannot do this. Vanessa and I are leaving together. You deserve someone who truly loves you. I am sorry." Emma read the message once. Then again. She did not cry. She simply looked toward the quiet lake where sunlight reflected across the water as though the world itself refused to acknowledge what had just happened. Around her, guests slowly realized the ceremony was over before it had even begun. Some expressed sympathy while others quietly gathered their belongings, unsure whether to comfort the bride or simply disappear before the embarrassment became even more painful. Emma's father gently stepped beside her. "Sweetheart, we can go home." She forced a small smile that barely reached her eyes. Everyone spent months planning today. They should at least enjoy the reception. Even now, she worried more about disappointing others than herself. Inside the beautifully decorated ballroom, untouched wedding cakes, carefully arranged centerpieces, and hundreds of glowing candles waited for a celebration that would never happen. Emma slowly removed the bouquet from her hands and placed it carefully on a nearby table. The engagement ring still rested on her finger, suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. As guests quietly filtered toward the exits, one man remained seated alone near the back of the ceremony. He had arrived only minutes before everything collapsed and had watched the entire heartbreaking scene unfold without interrupting. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he carried himself with calm confidence rather than curiosity. His name was Ethan Brooks. At 40 years old, he had built one of the nation's most successful investment firms, yet almost nobody at the venue recognized him because he avoided publicity whenever possible. Ethan had originally come to attend the wedding as the unexpected guest of one of Ryan's former business associates, but after witnessing the cruel message and the quiet dignity with which Emma carried herself, leaving no longer felt right. He watched as Emma thanked each vendor personally, apologizing for circumstances she had never created. She hugged the musicians, assured the catering staff they would still be paid, and even thanked guests for coming despite the heartbreaking outcome. There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet grace. Ethan found himself unexpectedly moved by the extraordinary strength of a woman whose entire future had collapsed in front of hundreds of people, yet who still chose kindness over anger. As the ballroom gradually emptied and the afternoon sun began slipping lower across the lake, Emma finally allowed herself one long breath before removing the engagement ring from her finger. She looked at it for several silent seconds, then closed her hand around it. At that exact moment, Ethan slowly walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "I know this is going to sound completely unreasonable," he said gently, "but before today ends, I would like to ask you a question that might change both of our lives." Emma stared at the stranger for several quiet seconds, convinced exhaustion and heartbreak had distorted reality. Around them, staff members carefully removed floral arrangements while waiters packed untouched dinner plates into insulated containers. The celebration she had imagined for nearly a year was disappearing piece by piece, yet the composed man standing before her remained unexpectedly calm. "I am sorry," Emma finally said with a tired smile. "I do not even know your name." The man extended his hand politely. "Ethan Brooks." She shook it gently. "Emma Hayes." Ethan nodded. "I know." Emma looked puzzled. "You do?" "Only because everyone here has been saying your name all afternoon." A brief silence settled between them before Ethan continued. I also know you handled today with more grace than most people could have managed. Emma looked down at the engagement ring resting in her palm. Grace feels easier than falling apart in front of 200 guests. Ethan smiled slightly. Perhaps. But most people still would have chosen anger. Emma carefully slipped the ring into a small velvet box and placed it inside her handbag. What was the question you wanted to ask? Ethan took a slow breath. Would you have dinner with me before making any decisions about the rest of your life? Emma blinked in surprise. Dinner? Only dinner, Ethan replied. Nothing more. She studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his expression, no hint of pity, and no attempt to take advantage of her vulnerable moment. He simply seemed sincere. A few minutes later they sat in a quiet corner of the reception hall while the catering staff served the meal originally prepared for the bride and groom. It felt strangely surreal. The elegant china, crystal glasses, and candlelight remained exactly as planned, yet everything had changed. Ethan listened far more than he spoke. Emma eventually admitted she owned a successful wedding planning business and had spent years helping couples celebrate the happiest day of their lives. The irony is almost unbelievable, she said softly. I have organized more than 100 weddings, but I could not save my own. Ethan gently shook his head. People who build beautiful moments for others cannot control the choices someone else makes. Emma looked at him thoughtfully. What about you? Ethan smiled faintly. I built a business instead of a family. She waited quietly for him to continue. Years ago I was engaged, he said. The relationship ended before the wedding because neither of us truly wanted the same future. Since then I have devoted almost every hour to work. Emma noticed sadness hidden beneath his calm voice. So why were you here today? Ethan answered honestly. A former business associate invited me at the last minute. He hesitated before adding, I almost declined. They shared a quiet laugh that felt surprisingly natural considering the circumstances. Outside, the last wedding guests finally departed while evening settled across the lake. Ethan looked directly at Emma with steady sincerity. I asked you to have dinner because I believe difficult days sometimes place complete strangers in each other's path for a reason. Emma smiled politely. That is a hopeful way to see today. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a neatly folded document, placing it gently on the table without pushing it toward her. Now I need to ask the unreasonable question I mentioned earlier. Emma glanced curiously at the unopened document before looking back at him. Ethan's voice remained calm, respectful, and completely serious. Emma, would you consider marrying me today, not because either of us is in love, but because I believe we might be able to help each other build the future both of us stopped believing was possible? Emma felt as though time itself had stopped. The quiet reception hall, the fading candlelight, the untouched wedding decorations, and the stranger sitting across from her suddenly seemed part of a story no one would believe. She looked down at the folded document resting on the table but made no attempt to open it. You cannot be serious, she whispered. Ethan Brooks did not look offended. Instead, he nodded calmly. I am completely serious. Emma leaned back in her chair, trying to understand how the worst day of her life had somehow become even more unbelievable. You have known me for less than 2 hours. Ethan smiled gently. That is true. She shook her head. You do not know my favorite food, where I grew up, what makes me laugh, or what scares me. Ethan answered without hesitation. I know something more important. Emma raised an eyebrow. What could possibly be more important? Ethan looked directly into her eyes. I know how you behave when your heart is breaking. The words settled quietly between them. He continued in the same steady voice. Most people reveal their true character when everything goes exactly as planned. I believe people reveal their real character when nothing goes according to plan. Emma remained silent. Ethan glanced toward the ballroom where employees carefully packed floral arrangements into delivery trucks. Your fiancé abandoned you in front of everyone who mattered to you, yet you thanked every vendor, apologized to your guests even though you had done nothing wrong, and made certain every employee would still receive full payment. That tells me more about your character than months of ordinary conversations ever could. Emma looked away toward the large windows overlooking the dark lake. No one had described the afternoon that way before. Everyone else had focused on what she had lost. Ethan was quietly describing what she had chosen to become instead. "Why me?" she finally asked. Ethan folded his hands together on the table. "Because I have spent years surrounded by impressive people who knew how to build companies but not relationships. Today I met someone who instinctively chose kindness during unimaginable disappointment. That is far rarer than financial success." Emma slowly opened the folded document. It was not a complicated legal contract filled with impossible conditions. It outlined only a few simple principles. Mutual respect. Complete honesty. Personal independence. Either person could end the marriage peacefully if it no longer served their shared purpose. There were no financial traps, no unreasonable demands, and no attempt to control her future. Ethan quietly explained each point. "I believe trust should never be forced. If you ever feel unhappy, you walk away with complete freedom." Emma looked at him carefully. Why would a successful man offer something like this to someone he barely knows? Ethan smiled faintly. Because success solved every problem except loneliness. Outside, the final guests departed, leaving the lakeside venue almost completely empty. Emma's parents approached quietly, worried about leaving their daughter alone. She introduced Ethan, briefly explaining that they had been talking. Her father greeted him politely before asking whether everything was all right. Emma looked at the people who had spent the entire day standing beside her despite their own heartbreak. Then she looked back at Ethan. She realized she had already learned one undeniable truth about the stranger across the table. While one man had disappeared the moment commitment became difficult, another had remained beside a woman he owed absolutely nothing. Ethan stood respectfully. "There is no pressure. If your answer is no, I will drive you home, wish you happiness, and you will never hear from me again." Emma held the unopened velvet ring box from her broken engagement in one hand and Ethan's simple proposal in the other. For the first time since waking that morning, she realized the future she had planned no longer existed. Yet perhaps that did not mean her future had ended. Perhaps it simply meant an entirely different story had quietly begun the moment one stranger chose to stay instead of walking away. The drive into downtown Charleston passed in thoughtful silence as the city lights reflected across the windshield and the extraordinary proposal continued echoing inside Emma Hayes's mind. She still held the folded agreement in her lap, reading each sentence again while Ethan Brooks focused quietly on the road. Every paragraph reflected respect instead of control, partnership instead of obligation. There were no impossible expectations, no hidden conditions, and no promises that sounded too perfect to believe. Finally Emma looked toward him. "If I say yes, what happens tomorrow?" Ethan answered honestly. "Tomorrow we begin learning who we really are. Nothing more complicated than that." Emma smiled faintly. "You make marriage sound surprisingly practical." Ethan returned the smile. "The practical part keeps people together long enough to discover whether something extraordinary might eventually grow." Early the next morning, they stood inside the historic Charleston County Courthouse accompanied only by Emma's parents, two close courthouse witnesses, and a county clerk who had performed hundreds of simple civil ceremonies throughout her career. No orchestra played. No elaborate floral arrangements decorated the room. No photographers waited outside the entrance. The only flowers Emma carried were a few white lilies rescued from yesterday's cancelled wedding reception. Before the ceremony began, the clerk looked at both of them with a warm smile. "Marriage is not about perfect timing," she said kindly. "Sometimes it begins when two people decide to face uncertainty together instead of facing it alone." Emma glanced toward Ethan. His expression remained calm, giving her every opportunity to change her mind without judgment. "You can still walk away," he whispered gently. Emma thought about Ryan's message, the empty altar, and the loneliness she had felt only 24 hours earlier. Then she remembered another image that had quietly replaced those painful memories. A complete stranger staying beside her when everyone else assumed the day was over. She took a slow breath. "I am staying." A few minutes later they exchanged simple vows prepared by the courthouse, promising honesty, respect, patience, and mutual support. Instead of using the engagement ring Ryan had once given her, Emma placed the velvet box inside her handbag and left it closed. Ethan had anticipated that choice. He quietly produced 2 plain platinum wedding bands chosen for their simplicity rather than extravagance. "These are only symbols," he said softly before placing one into her hand. "The real commitment will be proven by our actions after today." Emma nodded with quiet understanding before slipping the ring onto his finger. When the ceremony ended, her parents embraced both of them with cautious hope. Her father gently shook Ethan's hand. "I do not know what the future holds," he admitted. "Neither do I," Ethan replied. "But I promise your daughter will always be treated with dignity." Those words meant more to Emma than any grand declaration of romance could have. Outside the courthouse, a cool ocean breeze drifted through the quiet streets as Ethan opened the passenger door of his car. "There is one more thing you should know," he said as they prepared to leave. Emma looked at him curiously. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before speaking with complete honesty. "The media will eventually discover who I am. When they do, your life will become much more public than it has ever been." Emma frowned slightly. "Who exactly are you, Ethan?" He gave a modest smile that carried no trace of pride. "I am the founder and majority owner of Brooks Global Capital." Emma stared at him, suddenly recognizing the company name that appeared regularly on financial news across the country. She slowly realized the quiet stranger she had married less than an hour earlier was not simply a successful businessman. He was one of the most respected billionaires in America, and somehow he had never considered that the most important thing worth mentioning about himself. The first weeks of their unexpected marriage felt less like a romance and more like 2 thoughtful strangers learning how to share the same peaceful rhythm. Ethan Brooks brought Emma Hayes to his waterfront home overlooking Charleston Harbor, not a sprawling mansion filled with unnecessary extravagance, but a beautifully designed residence where warm wood, natural light, and quiet elegance mattered far more than displays of wealth. Emma had expected endless staff members, rigid routines, and a life dictated by luxury. Instead, she found a home where Ethan brewed his own coffee every morning, watered the small herb garden outside the kitchen, and greeted every employee by name before asking about their families. On her first morning there, Emma walked downstairs expecting an awkward silence. Instead, she found breakfast already prepared. Ethan looked up from the newspaper with an easy smile. "Good morning. I was not sure whether you preferred coffee or tea, so I made both." Emma laughed softly. "You are making this arrangement surprisingly difficult." Ethan looked confused. "How so?" She smiled. "It is much easier to keep emotional distance from someone who is impossible to live with." Ethan chuckled quietly before returning to the stove. "Then perhaps I should burn the pancakes." She shook her head. "Please do not." The simple conversation felt strangely comforting. Neither of them pretended they were deeply in love. Neither tried to force feelings that did not yet exist. Instead, they built something far more stable. Respect arrived first. Trust followed quietly behind it. During the following days, Ethan showed Emma every corner of the property, including a small library overlooking the water. Shelves filled with books about architecture, history, leadership, and community development surrounded a single reading chair positioned beside wide windows. Emma noticed several books about event design and hospitality management. "You read these?" she asked with genuine surprise. Ethan nodded. "Years ago I wanted to understand why some gatherings changed people's lives while others were forgotten the next day." Emma smiled. "That sounds like something a wedding planner would say." Ethan returned the smile. "Perhaps I missed my calling." As the days passed, Emma slowly resumed working with her wedding planning company. She worried her new marriage would make clients uncomfortable, especially after local newspapers began reporting that she had quietly married billionaire investor Ethan Brooks only one day after her cancelled ceremony. Instead, something unexpected happened. Couples called not because of the headlines but because they admired how she had carried herself through heartbreak without bitterness. Her business grew stronger than ever. One afternoon she returned home to discover Ethan sitting on the back porch reviewing proposals from several nonprofit organizations. Curious, she asked what he was working on. Ethan explained that Brooks Global Capital invested a portion of its annual profits into educational scholarships, small business grants, and neighborhood revitalization projects. He handed her one proposal. "Would you tell me what you think?" Emma looked surprised. "You want my opinion?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "You notice people before numbers. That perspective makes better decisions." Emma carefully reviewed the proposal before suggesting several practical improvements based on her experience organizing community events. Ethan listened attentively, occasionally writing notes in the margin. When she finished, he smiled with genuine appreciation. "That is exactly why I asked." No one had ever valued her ideas so naturally before. Ryan had often dismissed her suggestions as emotional. Ethan treated them as essential. That evening, while watching sailboats drift across the harbor beneath a glowing sunset, Emma reached into her handbag and looked once more at the unopened velvet box containing the engagement ring from her previous life. She quietly placed the box inside a drawer of the bedside table without opening it. Then she looked at the simple platinum wedding band resting on her hand. It had been worn without certainty, without expectation, and without romance. Yet somehow, with every ordinary conversation and every quiet act of kindness, it was beginning to feel more genuine than the promise she had once believed would last forever. Several months passed before Ethan Brooks invited Emma Hayes to accompany him to the annual Brooks Global Foundation Gala in New York City. Unlike the wedding where she had once stood abandoned beneath white roses, this event celebrated entrepreneurs, educators, veterans, and community leaders whose work had transformed neighborhoods across the country. As they entered the grand ballroom together, Emma immediately noticed something unusual. Although Ethan was one of the wealthiest men in the room, he spent almost no time speaking about business. Instead, he introduced her to scholarship recipients, nonprofit directors, teachers, and small business owners whose dreams had been supported by the foundation. Every conversation centered on people rather than profits. Emma quietly observed the respect others showed him. It was not the admiration reserved for powerful executives. It was genuine gratitude earned through years of keeping promises. During the reception, an elderly school principal approached Ethan with tears of appreciation. "Because of your foundation," she said, "our students finally have a science laboratory. Children who once believed they had no future are now applying to engineering programs." Ethan smiled warmly before gently redirecting the conversation toward the teachers who had spent countless hours helping those students succeed. As the principal walked away, Emma looked at him thoughtfully. "You never mention these projects." Ethan shrugged lightly. "The work matters. The recognition does not." Later that evening, the foundation announced a surprise fundraising challenge for a new youth entrepreneurship center. The organizers hoped to raise enough money before the evening ended to begin construction the following spring. Emma quietly reviewed the presentation materials and immediately noticed something missing. Years of planning weddings had taught her how people emotionally connected with stories, not statistics. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "May I suggest something?" He smiled without hesitation. "Always." Emma approached the event director and politely offered a different sequence for the presentation. Instead of beginning with financial charts, she suggested inviting several young entrepreneurs to tell their personal journeys before discussing funding goals. The organizers quickly agreed. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the ballroom completely changed. Guests who had politely applauded earlier now listened with genuine emotion as students described how mentors, scholarships, and small business programs had changed their lives. Donations increased dramatically throughout the evening, surpassing every expectation before the final presentation concluded. The executive director approached Emma afterward with heartfelt appreciation. "That was remarkable," she said. "You helped everyone remember that numbers represent real people." Ethan looked at Emma with quiet admiration. "I knew you would notice something the rest of us overlooked." Emma laughed softly. "I only rearranged the order." Ethan gently shook his head. "You reminded us why the order mattered." As guests continued celebrating the successful fundraiser, familiar voices unexpectedly echoed from across the ballroom entrance. Emma instinctively turned and immediately recognized Ryan Mitchell and Vanessa Cole standing near the registration desk. Both looked stunned as they noticed Ethan and Emma together. Ryan's confident expression slowly disappeared while Vanessa whispered something he could not hear. They had clearly come expecting another business networking event, never imagining the woman Ryan had abandoned months earlier would now stand beside one of America's most respected billionaires as his wife. Emma felt a brief wave of old memories but no longer experienced the pain that once accompanied them. She simply looked toward Ethan, who quietly reached for her hand without saying a single word. His gesture carried no possessiveness and no performance for the people watching nearby. It offered only calm reassurance. For the first time since the wedding that never happened, Emma realized she was no longer measuring her life by what she had lost. She was beginning to recognize the extraordinary future she had quietly found the moment one stranger chose compassion instead of convenience. For a brief moment, the ballroom seemed to shrink into complete silence. Ryan Mitchell stared across the room as though he could not convince himself the woman standing beside Ethan Brooks was the same bride he had abandoned only months earlier. Vanessa Cole quietly adjusted her expression, attempting to replace surprise with confidence, but the uncertainty in her eyes was impossible to hide. Around them, guests continued greeting Ethan with genuine warmth while several foundation board members thanked Emma for her remarkable contribution to the evening's fundraising success. Ryan finally walked toward them, stopping a respectful distance away. "Emma," he said quietly, "I did not expect to see you here." Emma smiled politely. "Good evening, Ryan." There was no bitterness in her voice, only calm courtesy. Ryan glanced toward Ethan before looking back at her. "I have wanted to talk to you for a long time." Ethan made no attempt to interrupt. Instead, he simply stepped slightly aside, allowing Emma complete freedom to respond however she wished. That small gesture did not go unnoticed. Emma appreciated that Ethan never tried to speak for her. "You can say what you need to say," she replied gently. Ryan lowered his eyes for a moment. "Leaving the wedding was the worst decision I have ever made." Emma listened without changing her expression. "I hurt you in a way no one deserves. I have thought about that day every week since it happened." Vanessa remained quietly beside him, clearly uncomfortable as nearby guests continued recognizing Ethan and Emma with sincere admiration. Ryan continued speaking. "I convinced myself I was chasing a better future. Instead, I walked away from the person who always believed in me." Emma looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes people only understand what they had after they choose to leave it behind." Ryan nodded slowly. "Would you ever consider giving me another chance if things had been different?" Before anyone else could react, Emma answered with complete honesty. "No." Her voice remained gentle rather than harsh. "Not because I hate you. I do not. And not because I want revenge. I do not. I simply became someone different after that day." Ryan quietly accepted her answer. Emma continued, "The woman standing at that altar believed love meant waiting for someone else to choose her. The woman standing here learned that love begins with choosing herself first." Ethan looked at Emma with quiet admiration, saying nothing because the moment belonged entirely to her. Ryan managed a faint smile filled with regret. "I understand." Emma nodded kindly. "I hope one day you build the life you truly want." "I sincerely mean that." Those words surprised Ryan even more than her refusal. He had expected anger, accusations, or humiliation. Instead, she offered peace. As Ryan and Vanessa quietly walked away, one of the foundation trustees approached Ethan carrying several project folders. Mr. Brooks, he said warmly, we would appreciate Mrs. Brooks joining next month's advisory committee. Her ideas tonight inspired our entire leadership team. Emma looked surprised. You want me to participate? The trustee smiled. Absolutely. Great organizations need people who understand both planning and people. After he left, Emma looked toward Ethan. You did not arrange that, did you? Ethan shook his head. No. You earned it yourself. They spent the remainder of the evening speaking with scholarship recipients, nonprofit leaders, and young entrepreneurs whose enthusiasm filled the ballroom with genuine optimism. On the flight home the following morning, Emma watched the sunrise above the clouds while quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. Months earlier she believed being left at the altar had destroyed her future. Now she understood something far more powerful. The most important door in her life had not closed that day. It had quietly opened the moment she stopped chasing someone who chose to leave and began walking beside someone who chose, every single day, to stay. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after returning from New York, but comfort did not mean everything became simple. Emma Hayes accepted the invitation to join the advisory committee of the Brooks Global Foundation, balancing her growing wedding planning business with community projects that now filled many of her weekends. Ethan Brooks never treated her contributions as symbolic. During every meeting, he asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully, and encouraged others to do the same. Emma slowly realized that his greatest strength was not commanding a room but creating space for everyone else to speak. One bright Saturday morning, they traveled together to Savannah, Georgia, where the foundation planned to restore a historic downtown building into a training center for aspiring entrepreneurs. Local residents, volunteers, architects, and small business owners gathered inside the aging brick structure, discussing ideas for classrooms, workshops, and shared office spaces. Emma walked through the empty halls, imagining how warm lighting, open gathering areas, and welcoming details could transform the building into a place where people immediately felt they belonged. She began sketching simple layout ideas on a notepad while speaking with teachers and neighborhood leaders. Ethan quietly watched her from across the room. She was completely in her element, listening before offering suggestions and finding practical solutions that brought different opinions together. Later that afternoon, a local newspaper published photographs from the planning event. By evening, several online entertainment websites had transformed the story into sensational headlines claiming the billionaire had rescued a heartbroken bride and given her a fairy tale life. Emma frowned while reading the articles. None of them mentioned the community project, the volunteers, or the entrepreneurs whose dreams had inspired the gathering. Everything focused only on wealth and romance. Ethan noticed her disappointment. Do not let strangers define your story, he said gently. They only see moments. We live the days between those moments. The following Monday, Emma received an unexpected phone call from Vanessa Cole. Her voice sounded unusually calm. I know this is unexpected, Vanessa admitted. But I would like to meet and apologize. Emma considered the request for several quiet seconds before agreeing to meet at a small waterfront cafe the next afternoon. Ethan did not ask to come with her. He simply said, whatever conversation you choose to have, I trust your judgment. The next day, Vanessa arrived early and stood as Emma approached the table. She looked noticeably different from the confident woman Emma remembered at the wedding. There was no arrogance in her expression, only quiet reflection. Thank you for coming, Vanessa said sincerely. Emma nodded politely and took a seat. After a long silence, Vanessa finally spoke. I spent months believing I had won something valuable. Eventually I realized I had built my happiness on someone else's heartbreak. That is not a victory. Emma listened without interrupting. Vanessa continued, Ryan and I ended our relationship several weeks ago. We wanted different lives, and I finally understood that relationships built from selfish choices rarely become peaceful ones. Emma looked at her thoughtfully. I appreciate your honesty. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted to acknowledge that what happened to you was wrong. Emma smiled gently. Holding on to resentment would only allow that day to continue controlling my future. I chose to let it go a long time ago. When Emma returned home that evening, Ethan was waiting on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee as the sun slowly disappeared beyond Charleston Harbor. She sat beside him and quietly described the conversation. Ethan listened carefully before asking only one question. "How do you feel now?" Emma looked across the peaceful water and smiled. "Lighter than I have felt in a very long time." Ethan smiled back, realizing that healing rarely arrives through dramatic victories. Sometimes it arrives through one honest conversation, one forgiven memory, and one quiet decision to keep walking toward a future no longer shaped by yesterday. Autumn arrived with crisp ocean air sweeping across Charleston Harbor as the Brooks Global Foundation prepared for its largest initiative of the year. Instead of hosting another elegant fundraising gala, Ethan Brooks proposed something different. He wanted to create a nationwide mentorship program connecting experienced business owners with young entrepreneurs from underserved communities. During the first planning meeting, executives presented detailed financial forecasts and operational schedules, but Ethan quietly turned toward Emma Hayes before approving anything. "What do you think we are missing?" he asked. Emma studied the presentation carefully before smiling. "Every chart explains how the program works. None of them explain why someone should believe they belong there." The room fell silent. She continued gently. "People rarely apply for opportunities when they believe those opportunities were designed for someone else." Ethan nodded thoughtfully before asking the communications team to redesign the entire campaign around personal stories rather than corporate achievements. Over the following weeks, Emma interviewed dozens of scholarship recipients, family-owned business founders, veterans opening their first companies, and students preparing to launch small neighborhood organizations. Instead of polished marketing language, she encouraged everyone to speak honestly about fear, failure, resilience, and hope. When the campaign launched nationally, applications exceeded every expectation. Newspapers praised the foundation for making entrepreneurship feel personal instead of intimidating. One evening, while reviewing the remarkable response from applicants across the country, Emma noticed an unopened envelope resting quietly on Ethan's desk. Her name appeared across the front in familiar handwriting. She recognized it immediately. Ryan Mitchell. She looked toward Ethan. "Did you read it?" Ethan shook his head. "It was addressed to you." Emma slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Ryan explained that after months of reflection, he had accepted a position with a nonprofit construction company rebuilding affordable housing in rural communities. He wrote that the experience had changed how he measured success and thanked Emma for responding to him with dignity rather than resentment. At the end of the letter, one sentence stood out. "Losing you forced me to become the person I should have been before I ever asked you to marry me." Emma quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. There were no tears, only peaceful acceptance. She carried it outside to the back porch where Ethan sat watching sailboats drift across the harbor beneath a golden sunset. She handed him the envelope. Ethan looked at it but did not open it. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. Emma smiled. "Not because I am hurt anymore." She sat beside him. "Because I finally realized forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply removes the past from controlling the future." Ethan looked toward the quiet water before speaking. "You have taught me something similar." Emma turned toward him with curiosity. Ethan smiled gently. "I spent years believing trust had to be earned slowly because disappointment always arrives eventually. Then one impossible day, a stranger trusted me enough to take one extraordinary step into the unknown." Emma laughed quietly. "That still sounds unbelievable when you say it out loud." Ethan nodded. "Perhaps. But every meaningful chapter of my life began the moment you decided not to let fear write the ending." They sat together without speaking as the evening sky slowly turned shades of amber and deep blue. Emma reached instinctively for his hand, not because their agreement required affection, not because appearances demanded it, but because somewhere between ordinary breakfasts, community projects, honest conversations, and countless quiet acts of respect, two strangers who had once shared nothing except heartbreak had gradually become the safest place either of them had ever known. Winter arrived gently along the Charleston waterfront as preparations began for the inaugural National Mentorship Summit hosted by the Brooks Global Foundation. Representatives from every state gathered to celebrate the success of the entrepreneurship initiative that Emma Hayes had helped reshape with one simple idea: putting people before presentations. The conference center overlooked the harbor, its wide glass windows filling every room with morning sunlight as volunteers welcomed students, educators, veterans, and first-time business owners. Ethan Brooks arrived early, as he always did, quietly greeting security officers, catering staff, and volunteers before any cameras appeared. Emma watched from across the lobby and smiled. No matter how many headlines called him one of the most influential billionaires in America, he never treated anyone as though their position determined their value. During the opening session, Emma introduced several young entrepreneurs whose businesses had flourished through the mentorship program. Instead of reading prepared biographies, she invited each participant to tell their own story. One young woman described opening her first bakery after years of working 2 jobs. A veteran explained how guidance from experienced business owners helped him launch a construction company employing fellow service members. A college student spoke about creating an educational technology startup after receiving encouragement from mentors who believed in her before investors ever did. The audience responded with standing applause because every success felt deeply personal. During a short break, one foundation director approached Ethan carrying several confidential reports. "The board would like to discuss next year's expansion immediately," he said. Ethan looked toward Emma, who was speaking with scholarship recipients nearby. "It can wait 1 hour," he replied calmly. "Right now those conversations matter more." The director smiled knowingly. "You have changed." Ethan answered quietly. "I finally learned what deserves my attention first." Later that afternoon, Emma wandered through a photography exhibit displaying images from foundation projects across the country. Children reading in renovated libraries, families receiving keys to their first homes, neighborhood markets reopening, and graduates proudly holding business certificates covered the gallery walls. Near the final display stood an old framed photograph from the Charleston courthouse taken on the day she and Ethan quietly married. She looked surprised because she had never seen the image before. Ethan walked beside her carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I hoped you would find that." Emma studied the photograph. They stood outside the courthouse smiling softly, neither pretending certainty nor hiding the uncertainty that had brought them there. "Who took this?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "One of the courthouse clerks recognized me after the ceremony. She mailed it several weeks later with a note that said some beautiful beginnings arrive wearing unexpected disguises." Emma laughed quietly before looking back at the photograph. "She was wiser than either of us." Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before reaching into his jacket pocket. Emma immediately recognized the small velvet box containing the engagement ring from the wedding that never happened. He placed it gently into her hands without opening it. "You have carried this through every chapter of our journey," he said softly. "I think it is finally time to let yesterday become yesterday." Emma slowly opened the box, looked at the ring one final time, then closed it with peaceful certainty. Together they walked toward the donation display where visitors contributed meaningful keepsakes representing new beginnings. Without sadness or anger, Emma placed the velvet box into the collection. She did not feel as though she had discarded part of her life. Instead, she had released the final weight tying her heart to a future that was never meant to be. As they quietly returned to the conference hall side by side, she slipped her hand into Ethan's, realizing that the strongest promises are rarely the ones spoken on a wedding day. They are the countless promises quietly kept every ordinary day afterward. Several weeks after the National Mentorship Summit concluded, Brooks Global Foundation received invitations from governors, universities, and nonprofit organizations requesting partnerships across the country. What had begun as a single mentorship initiative was quietly becoming a nationwide movement. Emma Hayes spent long afternoons reviewing proposals with educators, civic leaders, and entrepreneurs, making certain every new project reflected the same principle that had guided the foundation from the beginning. Opportunity should always feel personal before it becomes practical. Ethan Brooks watched her lead meetings with calm confidence, often noticing how quickly people trusted her. She never dominated conversations. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions until everyone around the table discovered the best solution together. One afternoon, after another successful planning session, the foundation's chief operating officer approached Ethan privately. "May I ask you something?" he said. Ethan nodded. "Of course." The executive smiled. "When you married Mrs. Brooks, did you expect her to transform this organization?" Ethan looked through the conference room window where Emma laughed with several scholarship recipients preparing for their first business presentations. "No," he answered honestly. "I hoped we might help each other heal." He paused before smiling quietly. "Everything else has been an unexpected gift." A few days later, the foundation hosted a leadership retreat at a peaceful coastal conference center outside Charleston. During one workshop, participants were asked to describe the person who had influenced their lives most deeply. Emma expected people to mention successful executives, famous entrepreneurs, or respected professors. Instead, nearly every story centered on ordinary acts of kindness. A teacher who stayed after school every evening. A neighbor who helped rebuild a family home after a storm. A grandmother who believed in a dream before anyone else did. Listening to those stories reminded Emma why the foundation's work mattered so deeply. Lasting change rarely began with extraordinary wealth. It almost always began with ordinary people choosing compassion. That evening, after the workshops concluded, Emma and Ethan walked slowly along the quiet beach as gentle waves rolled across the shoreline beneath a sky filled with winter stars. Neither hurried to fill the silence. They had learned that the most meaningful conversations often arrived naturally when no one tried to force them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Do you remember the agreement I placed on the table the day we met?" Emma smiled warmly. "I remember every word." Ethan looked toward the horizon where the ocean disappeared into darkness. "One sentence has become completely untrue." Emma laughed softly. "Which one?" He turned toward her. "The part that said either of us could leave whenever the arrangement no longer served its purpose." Emma studied him quietly. Ethan continued with gentle sincerity. "This stopped being an arrangement a long time ago. Somewhere between shared breakfasts, long flights, community projects, ordinary evenings, and conversations like this, you became the person I look for first every morning and the person I want beside me at the end of every day." Emma felt emotion rise gently within her heart, not because his words were dramatic, but because they reflected the quiet consistency he had shown since the afternoon they first met. She smiled through grateful eyes before answering. "I realized something similar when I stopped thinking of your house as your home and quietly began calling it ours." Ethan reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the original agreement they had both signed months earlier. Without ceremony or grand speeches, they looked at the familiar pages together one final time. Then, with peaceful certainty, they carefully folded the document once more and placed it inside the foundation archives, not as a contract that still defined their marriage, but as a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with two strangers choosing trust before either of them fully understands where that single courageous decision will eventually lead. Spring arrived exactly 1 year after the wedding that had never happened, bringing warm ocean breezes back to Charleston and quietly reminding Emma Hayes how completely life could change in 12 months. On a bright Saturday morning, Ethan Brooks asked her to take a short drive without explaining where they were going. Emma laughed as they followed the familiar coastal highway. "You have become very good at keeping secrets." Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "Only the happy ones." Nearly an hour later, they arrived at the same lakeside estate where Emma had once stood alone beneath an arch of white roses after Ryan Mitchell disappeared. She stepped out of the car slowly, recognizing the peaceful shoreline immediately. The memories returned, but this time they no longer carried pain. Instead, they reminded her how unexpectedly life had redirected itself on the very day she believed everything was over. As they walked toward the ceremony lawn, Emma noticed that the entire property had been quietly transformed. Children from foundation scholarship families played on the grass while community leaders, teachers, volunteers, veterans, entrepreneurs, and several couples whose weddings Emma had planned over the years gathered together smiling warmly. Her parents stood near the entrance, their eyes filled with quiet happiness. Even the musicians from the cancelled wedding returned, greeting her as though they had been waiting for this day all along. Emma turned toward Ethan with surprised emotion. "What is all this?" Ethan answered gently. "Last year we became husband and wife inside a courthouse because circumstances gave us no other choice. I have never regretted that day for a single moment. But I wanted to give you something different." He reached into his jacket and carefully removed a small envelope. Inside rested a handwritten invitation that simply read, "A celebration of the marriage that quietly changed two lives." Emma smiled through grateful tears as they walked together toward the beautifully decorated ceremony space. There was no pressure, no performance, and no attempt to recreate the wedding she had lost. Instead, every detail reflected the life they had built together afterward. White lilies decorated the aisle because they had been the only flowers remaining after the cancelled wedding. Simple platinum rings reflected the sunlight, reminding them that genuine commitment had never depended on expensive symbols. Family, friends, scholarship recipients, foundation volunteers, and ordinary people whose lives had crossed theirs filled every seat, representing the community they had built together rather than the expectations they had once carried separately. When the officiant invited them to speak, Ethan looked at Emma with the same calm sincerity she had trusted from the beginning. "The day we met, I asked a complete stranger to believe that kindness could become the foundation of something extraordinary. I thought I was offering you a future. Looking back, you were the one who gave me mine." Emma smiled before answering softly. "I believed my story ended when someone chose to leave me at the altar. I never imagined the greatest chapter of my life would begin because someone else quietly chose to stay." Their guests applauded warmly as they exchanged personal vows written during the previous weeks, promising to continue choosing patience, honesty, respect, and compassion long after celebrations ended. As the ceremony concluded, Emma looked across the peaceful lake where her heartbreak had once begun. The same water reflected the same afternoon sunlight, yet everything felt completely different. She finally understood that painful endings do not always arrive to punish us. Sometimes they simply clear the path toward blessings we never would have chosen for ourselves. Walking hand in hand beside Ethan while joyful laughter surrounded them, Emma realized that the happiest wedding of her life had not been the one she spent years planning. It was the one built quietly, patiently, and faithfully through countless ordinary days after two strangers discovered that the strongest love is never rushed into existence. It is created one thoughtful choice at a time. 1 year later, the story that had begun with heartbreak quietly became one of the most inspiring examples of hope anyone who knew Emma Hayes and Ethan Brooks had ever witnessed. Brooks' Global Foundation expanded into dozens of communities, supporting small businesses, mentoring young entrepreneurs, restoring historic neighborhoods, and helping families build brighter futures. Yet whenever reporters asked Ethan about the organization's remarkable growth, he always redirected the conversation toward the people whose lives had changed instead of the company's accomplishments. Whenever they praised his leadership, he simply smiled and said, "The strongest ideas usually come from listening to someone else." Emma had become an essential voice within the foundation, not because she carried the title of the billionaire's wife, but because people trusted her judgment, compassion, and ability to see potential long before others noticed it. Wedding planning remained close to her heart as well. She continued helping couples celebrate meaningful beginnings, but now every ceremony carried an even deeper message. She gently reminded nervous brides and grooms that perfect weddings never guaranteed lasting marriages. Honest promises, daily respect, patience, and kindness were the true foundations of love. One afternoon, while organizing keepsakes inside their home office overlooking Charleston Harbor, Emma opened a small wooden memory box containing several objects from the extraordinary year that had changed both their lives. Inside rested the original courthouse marriage certificate, the simple handwritten agreement they had once signed as strangers, a photograph taken outside the courthouse on their wedding day, and the invitation Ethan had given her before the celebration beside the lake. One empty space remained inside the box. Ethan quietly entered the room carrying another familiar object. Without saying a word, he placed the small velvet box containing the abandoned engagement ring beside the others. Emma looked at it thoughtfully before smiling. Together they attached a small handwritten note beneath it. Some promises are meant to end so better promises can begin. Then they closed the memory box, not to hide the past, but to honor every lesson it had taught them. That evening they walked together along the same Charleston waterfront where they had shared countless conversations over the previous year. Sailboats drifted peacefully across the harbor while the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan gently took Emma's hand, just as he had done on difficult days and joyful ones alike. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Ryan had arrived at the altar that morning?" he asked quietly. Emma smiled with peaceful certainty. "Sometimes." She looked toward the glowing horizon before continuing. "But not because I wish life had been different. Only because it reminds me that what feels like the greatest disappointment can quietly become the greatest blessing." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They stood together watching families stroll along the waterfront, children laughing nearby, and ordinary people creating ordinary memories that often become life's most extraordinary treasures. Neither of them believed fate alone had written their story. Every meaningful chapter had been shaped by countless daily choices to trust, forgive, listen, encourage, and remain present for one another. The wedding that never happened had once seemed like the end of everything Emma believed about love. Instead, it became the beginning of a life she never would have imagined, shared with a man who proved that true wealth is measured neither by fortune nor influence, but by character revealed through consistent actions. As evening settled peacefully across the harbor, Emma rested her head gently against Ethan's shoulder, grateful that one stranger had chosen compassion on the darkest day of her life. Sometimes the happiest endings do not arrive because everything goes according to plan. Sometimes they arrive because life quietly leads us towards someone who chooses to stay when everyone else has already walked away.